Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. There are famously hard problems in mathematics, like Fermat's last theorem, with his truly marvelous proof that a margin was too narrow to contain, the shortest path for a traveling salesperson, and dealing with integers in JavaScript. Which means, this week we chat with Liran Tal about secure coding in Node.js. No news segment this week. Instead, we have two short interviews recorded at this year's RSA conference. Count your bits and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva, a Talus company, is the cybersecurity leader that helps organizations protect critical applications, APIs, and data anywhere, at scale, and with the highest ROI. With an integrated approach combining edge, application security, and data security, Imperva protects companies through all stages of their digital journey. Imperva Threat Research and their global intelligence community enable Imperva to stay ahead of the threat landscape and seamlessly integrate the latest security, privacy, and compliance expertise into their solutions. Start a free trial today at securityweekly.com/Imperva. This is episode 286, recorded May 20th, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Akira Brand. Hello, Akira.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to hear your voice. We've got a fun show coming up. But first, we've got to get through two announcements, so bear with me. Get ready for an electrifying experience at the 15th annual Identiverse. Join 3,000 plus identity professionals in Vegas from May 28th to 31st for 4 days packed with dynamic learning and collaboration. As a community member, receive 25% off your Identiverse 2024 tickets using code IDV24-SW25. Register today at securityweekly.com/IDV2024. And dive into cybersecurity with Cyber Risk Alliance for exclusive insights from RSA Conference 2024. Explore executive interviews with industry leaders and curated articles on trends and innovations. For all of that and more, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC. Liran Tal is an award-winning software developer, security researcher, and open source champion in the JavaScript community. He's an internationally recognized GitHub star, acknowledged for his open source advocacy, and has received the OpenJS Foundation's Pathfinder for Security for his work on Node.js. His contributions to developer security education include leading OWASP projects, building supply chain security tools, participating in CNCF and OpenSSF initiatives, and authoring books such as O'Reilly's Serverless Security. He leads the developer advocacy team at Sneak.io and is on a mission to empower developers with better application security skills. Hello, Liran. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Akira. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, one thing I neglected to mention in your bio is that you also have a wonderful hat that listeners may not see, but those of you watching the video are going to check it out. Or if they go to your GitHub site, they'll see this. So I guess I just want to say kudos and thanks for joining with a wonderful hat.
Oh, yeah. I just made myself a copy of yours as well.
So one of the things I wanted to start off before we get into the work that you've done is your background. Are you an AppSec person starting to reach out more to developers, or developer now learning, sharing knowledge about security? How did you get to this point?
I'm a developer at heart, for sure. Started, building stuff. I guess like a lot of us in the industry, kind of like started breaking things as well. But kind of like, starting from the Linux kind of thing, compiling things, then later building apps and packages or whatnot. So I like building that. I like the ability to like build those things. But ever since I think got in love with security and security aspects to an extent, like showing all the misbehaviors, unintended desires of softwares. It's been a pleasure, kind of like I think bouncing back and forth between the developer persona and the security persona. So having a lot of time, a lot of fun time, enjoying doing security research, which is pretty cool aspect of, being also able to like read code and kind of like, reason about it.
So sometimes a motivation about, developers coming into security is that security doesn't always have a great outreach, and you do have a good outreach. I'm curious though, was there something that, what was some of the poor advice you got, or some of the bad encounters you had with AppSec that were perhaps a motivation to do better?
Yeah. So I think one of the poor examples is the fact that it was like the lack of security advice, right? Like the lack of security engagement. So picture the day-to-day developer at a team. Security team is sometimes virtually non-existent. There's like no interaction, no engagement, no activities with security people or the security concept as a whole. That's I think something that's a gap that we should probably be doing better in terms of like creating more mutual engagements, mutual activities, just like mutual interest, like build better software. Some of the great advice I think is generally thinking, putting yourself in kind of like the attacker, the malicious actor, the other side of the party of what you're building. Sometimes that's even a good advice for like, people doing a lot of like QA, back in the day, 15 years ago or something like that, where you kind of like want to know kind of like, what's not the happy path? Like what's the worst path? Like what people are going to do very differently from how you build the app. And sometimes that just ends up as like a broken, functional app, but in the worst cases, it's also a security issue, a security bug. So, having adopted that mindset, and from that, when you like the next jump you make is, never trust user input as like the very solid core, get to go is where I would go.
And then you've turned that. So I'd love to talk about your book now, about your outreach, because I think what you've done is turned that into possibly what sounds like the type of education you wish you had, or the type of outreach and engagement you had, because you're not going through checklists, right? You're not just saying, don't do this, don't trust all of the user input. Tell us a little bit about what your approach actually is.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good segue, because I've kind of like wanted to kind of like teach about security in a fun way, in like an engaging way. And what that means is, when you like, I'm a fan of like, thriller, TV shows or movies, like, there's a detective, finding a bug, finding something, there's a murder, there's a mystery, right? You can like try to dissolve something that is not right. And I kind of like wanted the book to be in the same way, right? Like when you're like a detective and there's like a mystery, there's a package with, vulnerable code, and kind of like that's how the book, or the series of books are kind of like written in a way where where there's a new vulnerability in some package. Some of them you might be using, and then we're kind of like talking with the reader, through the book, like, okay, so let's install it. Let's try and use it. There's like the very easy kind of basic stuff, but then we kind of like unfold it to like try and do something with it, and then find that there's like an undesired, like a different behavior that was not intended. And then we kind of like look at the code. So there's like a lot of code involved. And I think readers, when they, both I think developers and security people alike, when they kind of like go through seeing, how the technical examples and, the routes that unfold within code, the code path changes and the decisions made by a maintainer of a package, of a library, of a piece of code, they kind of like are able to relate a lot more to it, because actually, like you said, it's not just a checklist, like, always sanitize user input. It's not as that. It's, we're trying to go through an actual use case of said package, which was found vulnerable. So there's an actual CVE. It really had an impact on, someone in the ecosystem, some developers or some companies. And then we go through that process of, okay, so we've learned that, this is vulnerable code. How can you now exploit it? What's the impact if you exploit it? Does it create a denial of service? Is it more like, you're able to like run, execute remote code? Like what's the impact that is kind of like, for you as a developer, if you use this package, if you use this kind of dependency? And then we get, that is like where the extra step of, not giving you boring checklist, but rather saying, okay, so let's look at what the fix was. And so when we do it, we kind of like, there's a lot of like taking the reader towards, he's like in the mindset of the maintainer of that library. Like what were they thinking when they were writing the fix code? And I've found several cases where a CVE was fixed, but then the fix applies, but then like sometimes 2-3 months, maybe a year later, another security researcher goes and reports a different vulnerability in in the same package. And when they through the triage process of understanding, the analysis of why it happened, we realized that the fix that was applied by the maintainer, maybe 2 months or a year ago, was actually an impartial fix, right? It wasn't the best, most inclusive way to kind of fix it. So that's like an interesting aspect. So you kind of like learn how not to do things or how to do things in a better way. And the whole book is kind of like surrounded across, this kind of like, mystery unraveling of like, different package stories, different, vulnerable code stories. And each of them has like, the lessons learned. Obviously there's like a best practices that's like a summarizing chapter. If someone feels, they don't want to go through the whole story, they can jump to like, chapter 8 or 9 or whatever and read the best practices. But I like that the notion of teaching through a story of something that happened.
Yeah, and I love that example too of walking through the fixes. That the fixes aren't just do this and you're done. In other words, there's lots of opportunities for engineering. There's different things, different ways that developers can approach the code. And I'm curious, as you're describing that, there's a mindset for developers to learn how is it being exploited. You're walking them through and how to fix it. Could you tell us a little bit more about how those conversations come around for how to fix it? Is it in the sense of the different choices they're making for input validation, the different choices they're making for, well, I would do this way, I would do this other way, because that's a very developer-focused type of conversation. The question was, to try to re-summarize, how the fixing aspect, lots of different developers might approach a fix differently. That's a very engineering focused type of discussion as opposed to the security example. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that developer mindset. What are the trade-offs they're making? What are ways to think about fixing these vulnerabilities?
All right, cool. I have like a that's a really good question actually, because I have like a very specific package vulnerability review in one of the books on that, and that's actually a very somewhat easy way to explain it. And so here's the case, right? There's I review one of the packages that were found to have a patch reversal vulnerability, and so the .. then you traverse back the path and access whatever files you want on the server that serves the application. And the fix, the initial fix, actually I think that was the perpetual fix that stayed there all the time. But just the fix itself was to replace specific characters like ... and like the /1 using a regular expression notion, right? And for whatever intent that was intended with that library to fix it, that scoping was narrow enough so that the regex works. But that is like the developer go-to, right? Like they need to fix something. The regular expression is something they can easily go to when string manipulation is relevant. But if you look at it from like a security perspective, with a security background, as a security practitioner, you are aware of concepts like output encoding, right? Input encoding or input sanitization and those kind of things. And so what I would say the more appropriate fix would have been to do something like encode or decode URI components. There's a specific API, JavaScript API to do that, which is kind of like it's basically the same thing as the regular expression in terms of the actual result, but it's a different way, right? It's a more kind of like declarative way of saying like what should really happen here. We should actually decode, kind of like escape back from the contents and not try to regular expression, search and replace the strings and the characters. Like that's like the most, I think, obvious and clear ways of like the differentiation between thinking about, being in the developer position of, maintaining a library versus the security position, right? The security maintainer or the security mindset of someone who has that experience to kind of like, project their concept of understanding application security.
I also love that's a path traversal. But Akira, you had a question.
Liran, there's a big difference between theory and practice sometimes when you're teaching, right? And I'm curious, when you are writing or when you're teaching, when do you know it's time to switch from like the theory of secure coding to the actual practice, like how you just described?
So I think it's kind of like the whole story, the way that even theory is presented, the more that you could speak to specific in like even like the demos or the examples that you use to explain the theory, that kind of like resonates a lot more. So if you take, for example, some specific examples to teach developers, just thinking off the bat of here, like cross-site scripting, right, for front-end developers. So a lot of the time, if you'll say, don't do DOM manipulation, right, like some DOM element that inner HTML or something, that's a good way, that's an okay way to kind of like provision, in a sense, the theory of what you're trying to say. But also, if you understand front-end developers these days, right, like modern developers who do not use jQuery and DOM manipulation, like most of them use frameworks, right? They use the React, the Vue, the Angular, all of those kind of things. And so if you want to kind of like provide a reference to what would happen, with a theory, you should probably give those examples. So React has this, dangerously set inner HTML, which you could then reason about. You could give that API as an example, and then suddenly everyone will kind of like understand what you're trying to say. Like, what's the gap? What's the actual missing link in terms of, the whole theory that it connects to. So I think a lot of the time, even to kind of like drive the theory home, to give that input, you have to ground that with specific kind of like real world and very current kind of like developer paradigms these days, because otherwise they kind of like lose you. It's way too generic, like saying output escaping or input sanitization. It's like way too generic terms. And the moment you kind of like say, okay, well, the way that you write JS6 on React, basically React does output encoding for you. And like, you put some screenshots or some code interface, and they kind of like, okay, now I understand what output encoding is, because otherwise, I would have a DOM element created here from the user. So I think those kind of like real world basis examples are useful.
And one of the things I love about that example is that it highlights the idea of showing developers code that looks like they would write, that looks like code that is in this modern age, rather than just a contrived cross-site scripting example. And you kind of continue that that way of thinking with, I'll use the word nitpicking, but it's pointing out that there's a lot of examples of code that's not necessarily the most secure. You had a recent blog post about poor express authentication patterns, and you're using that to talk about that it's okay, but it could be better. So tell us a little bit about why, in a friendly manner, you're being nitpicky. Why are you pointing at these code examples?
Good. I'm happy for that question. Because I want to say first, I'm like one of those developers who I'm kind of like nitpicking now. That was like me in the past, right? I wanted to write code and teach developers, and I may have sometimes even myself taught developers to go through insecure ways. So we all kind of do that, and that's okay. I think the problem is with those examples is, when they use insecure coding, and there's like no disclaimer that says, please don't do this in production, or, they don't have to go through like the details, but the problem is that it perpetuates, right? It perpetuates that knowledge. And, having a past, again, like, 15 years back or so, doing a lot of like PHP development, all the PHP people are like, oh my God, no, it was worse back then. It was so worse back then.
It was.
I get it. But that's kind of like how we learned, right? We kind of like, sometimes through books, sometimes through tutorials, because it was handy, and stuff like that. And it perpetuates that knowledge of doing things in a bad way, in an insecure way. And I want to call out specific examples in that blog post, because it showed some kind of like, I think, called it poor cookie configuration. So things like, there's no secure flag, there's no same site configuration at all. There's like other specifics that were not intended, but that was like not, actually that was not even what drove me kind of like a bit nuts about it, because, I can understand those, like you're building a local app, who cares about whatever.
Fair enough.
All this cookie configuration, maybe it's not even that important for the app to function. So it's just some default. That's okay. But it was, the one thing that kind of like had me glaring at that blog post and then finding out all the cookie misconfiguration and stuff like that was the way they were doing authentication, which was essentially, I think it relied on some MongoDB or some JSON powered, JS powered database API. And there's like a users.find, user from the input equals username, and then password equals password. And so at that moment, you can like realize, well, there's both NoSQL injection here. There's plain text password matching here, which is also bad. And there's also, like no timing, secure timing kind of like protection for, doing the comparison. And so these are like maybe except for like the secure comparison, the timing attack wise, but the others like, plain text passwords and stuff like that, it's like that should be like very basic, if you're teaching someone to do authentication, that's like a very basic rule that you should have to like not do that, unless again you just put like a disclaimer, please do not do this. This is just for like the sake of, I'm comparing some, memory based user entries, whatever. But unless you're like putting that out there, you're like teaching developers to compare plain text passwords, which is like really, 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 really bad. So those are my nitpicks, but hopefully, we can, I haven't, this is me saying about this. I haven't publicly shamed anyone. I didn't, link to the blog. I was hoping, more Express readers would fall onto this blog, and learn what not to do than, follow something else.
Sure. What I love about that, I think that's a great example of how you were talking about this, is that you take, 1 or 2 dozen lines of code and turn it into a discussion point for a couple of different security areas. CSRF, talking about, just the cookie handling, talking about password management, or, stronger methods of authentication, which I think, and you're putting it into this example that's on the web, which is similar to, we talk about the cliches of Stack Overflow there, how much people just cut and paste from there, stuff like that.
Like a long AI powered code
yes,
tools
exactly.
right now.
All the AIs are trained on all this bad code now too. So you've also. I'm curious, what kind of tell us a little bit about the feedback you get from developers, because it's one thing for us to say, to talk to them, give them that attacker mentality as you're describing the book. Here is a vulnerability. Here's how to exploit it. Here's how to fix it. And what I'm curious about is, how do developers react to that? How do we know I'm speaking from an application security perspective here. How can we as like the AppSec industry know we're connecting with developers because they're giving us feedback of some sort? They're saying thank you, something like that. How have your readers reacted to your blog posts, the books, or presentations you've given?
I think that hacker mentality is actually that's the one that drives the ball home, because a lot of the time when we say in the security space that security is a lot of the time just invisible, right? Because you don't know, you haven't been hacked, you haven't been breached, so do you have good security? It's kind of like you don't know what your how to quantify that, right? That's like the invisible hardships of security. And it translates to developers. They don't care, because, they say like, we never had a security breach for like the last 10, 15 years. Doesn't mean that, everything is okay, but, it's hard to kind of like quantify and put that value out there for them. And I think the moment that you can like, not just teach the theory and the best practices, you can like leave that to the past, right? They are interested in that, but they first kind of like want to know like, what's the impact? What's going on here, right? Like when you want to teach them about performance optimization, you don't just tell them, hey, do this and do that, don't do queries like that, or don't do, front end rendering in this or that way. Kind of like start with, what's the impact of not doing it, right? Like not rendering the website in a second would cost you like, I don't know, $10 million, dollars in ARR because you haven't, optimized for that. So same way, you can like take that approach and bring that to security, and you say, okay, what's the impact of that? And doing those, we call them kind of like live hacks, or, like hands-on hacking on, through the book, through the presentations, through the demos, whatever, when we talk to developers, And I think in one of my actually a container security specific demo, I was showing a vulnerable Node runtime. So like the runtime being vulnerable is like the last thing you really want, because like anyone can interact with that. That's like in the call path of, interaction with the app. It's not related to any of the code you write. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was, I think coincidentally, that was a path traversal one. And I took in that 5 or 10 minutes, I showed that demo, and I took the entire, black hat approach of using a kind of like an offensive tool to do reconnaissance on that machine, on that node runtime being vulnerable, then running and detecting that it is vulnerable to path traversal, and then shooting out that payload with curl and getting a file. And I think the moment I was showing that, people understood like what's the impact when you have a path traversal vulnerability, and also to an extent how sometimes easy it is, or it could be, to attackers to just pick and choose their targets in a way, and just launch offensive security tools at them. And I think that is people, when specifically, I think more developers, right? Like security people know this, but developers, when they see that, they kind of like, oh, okay, so like this is what can happen. I'm gonna think twice before I leave a very old, outdated, end of life Node version running in production. And I'm hoping that this leaves that notion with them that the security aspect is important.
So, Liran, when you're talking to developers, there's of course different levels, right? There's juniors all the way up to staff, and then we have our engineering managers. How do you approach teaching things like, like a pretty hardcore black hat, walkthrough of a vulnerability in a way where everyone can understand and actually get some value out of that?
So I think essentially there's what happens within like the code, the app itself, and that is what kind of like maybe resonates with developers more specifically. But then when you kind of zoom out a bit from just the app itself and talk about like the more wider impact, the blast radius of what can go wrong in terms of like the industry sometimes, then that kind of like resonates a little bit more. And I think one practical example that's not just managers, but just generally executive leaders within the organization that they can relate to is concepts of supply chain security, because they know that their developers are building out of open source, right? So open source packages, and they use it, this and that. And the moment you talk about how, one open source package, when a developer installed it, they potentially, were kind of like tricked to install a malicious package. And then all of their environment variables were kind of like, leaked, because, that's what the malicious package did. It leaked all of those, tokens and everything else, sent that to some remote server. And then it's not really a problem of like the developer coding. It's not even just the developer hygiene of security, like whether they were using, 2FA or MFA or something like that. But also it kind of like expands and says, hey, you know what? Like it's how you manage maybe open source, or how you manage software, how you manage secrets in the way that your R&D organization is kind of like, is formed. And so it kind of like opens a lot of doors to think of, all the things that could go wrong. So I think when you kind of like zoom out from the code and like talk about, supply chain security, CI breaches that were happening, those kind of like very, I think, interesting and sometimes like from a different perspective of looking at the security impact, kind of like gets everyone together to like understand, oh yeah, that's probably bad. If I'm using open source, I shouldn't really install packages in this way.
And part of that, you chose Node.js as an area to focus on, which I think is brave, because there's so much security problems and so many packages out there. In part of some of the work, as I mentioned in your bio, you still do some work with OWASP projects, and you've got an NPM security cheat sheet. There's a couple areas on there that I wanted to kind of chat with you about and maybe expand on a little bit, because I like its approach, because you do touch on protecting secrets. You touch on just managing packages in general. And you mentioned like using proxies. I'll come back to that in a second. But you also mentioned keeping packages up to date. Do they always have to be on the latest version? And you said, in the cheat sheet, I'm kind of paraphrasing, you kind of say no. which I don't disagree with, but I'd love to hear the benefit of our listeners, the rationale behind that. Why? Because otherwise it sounds like I should just be on the latest, right?
Yeah. It's a good one you picked to talk about. So package dependencies or just libraries in general where you use them in your code. So generally speaking, try to I'm working on eggshells here because there's so many camps.
I understand.
Here.
Yeah.
But, I would say generally speaking, you kind of want to keep them up to date with your needs, right? Your needs are your application needs. So sometimes you kind of want to pin a version to major version 3 and not 4 because 4 literally has API breaking changes and you do not want to upgrade, right? That's very good reason not to. Other reasons, now going into the security aspect of it, of why not updating, is maintainers who actually control the dependency nested tree of all, whatever dependency is added into a nested tree. So when you install package X, it actually may be using, 10 levels or whatever of nested dependencies. And so you're bringing in code from people who actually haven't looked at their code, general maintainers. And with NPM in its default state right now, even to this recording, when you install packages, any maintainer on that level of tree can run any arbitrary command they want during your NPM installation process for Node. And so, yes, that is scoped only to whatever user you're using to install it, but that's still a pretty bad thing to do because your user probably still owns the config JSON, which has all the API keys, because otherwise your app wouldn't run. So you're in a really bad state anyway. And so the reason not to upgrade all the time to the latest versions or, beyond, again, the functional requirements are generally, we've seen examples of basically at least 3 or 4 different things. Either maintainers had their accounts compromised. So, React, Express, Koa, about maybe 20 more or 50 more packages, who one of their maintainers had used either a bad passwords, literally 1, 2, 3, 4, or something else that was leaked, but then they added, I don't know, an ampersand or whatever at the end of it. And someone was able to guess that. This is a real world research from about 2017, and they were able to gain access to publish packages for React and Express and Koa and all of those libraries. So just imagine if this wasn't some, white hat hacker, ethical hacker who would do it, what would be the consequence if you just, upgraded to the latest version? Everyone did. It was de facto. And then someone would just use that and literally at that moment impact so many, developers. This is one case. There were so many others. Event stream. There were cases of maintainers having this now somewhat of a trend of a protest war. So they were protesting against non-funding of open source, which very legitimate, but maybe just not the way to do it is to compromise your user base. But they were just literally breaking apart the latest version. So if you upgraded to the latest version, a minor or a patch, not even a major version, you would have suffered from a denial of service in the app itself. And this specific case was actually a dependency that was part of that was powering, right? Was part of an app for AWS CDK. Amazon Web Services would have been, their CLI would have been actually not would have been. It actually did impact them. And so many others as well. I think Playwright from Microsoft, an end-to-end or just general testing library. All of them used that dependency, but the fact that they used it and it kind of during the install process took the latest version, nothing was pinned, it was able to impact so many users. So the way I want to tell people to upgrade packages is, if you do want to keep up with, the trend, the industry, not stay too far behind, is you kind of have to take an approach where you upgrade after some buffer of time, right? You kind of you don't upgrade to the latest version. You give that latest version some time to the community to vet it, to make sure there's no malicious, backdoors in there or whatever, exit utils, all of those kind of things. And then try and keep up with it. But definitely, my choice is not to upgrade to the latest version, with only one exception of a rule. That exception is the one that we can all agree here in security, which is, if that latest version fixes a security vulnerability, you want to upgrade super fast. But unless that is a security purpose. If it's just to like keep up with the trends or APIs or new features or whatever, you kind of like give it some time to everyone to kind of like vet it.
That's a wonderful walkthrough of that reasoning, which makes a lot of sense rather than just be the latest and greatest. And what I also appreciate about that is you're demonstrating what I think you also do in your book is that, and in your blog post, there are nuances. Security is not just a binary, this is the problem, this is how you fix it. There are trade-offs, there are second order effects, things like that. One other thing before, I don't want to go off that cheat sheet series quite yet. There was another thing about proxies. Let's talk about that too, because proxies are one of those things that are a great idea. Not everybody can do them, but they have some security benefits that might not be immediately obvious to listeners. Why are you a proponent of using proxies to access an artifact store like NPM or PyPy?
Yeah. So the proxies there are somewhat in relation to several things. One is rather new, I think 2021 incident disclosure of this thing called dependency confusion, in which proxies play a very pivotal role. Not the only, but one of them. And so a misconfigured proxy could actually get you to install the wrong package in a variety of language ecosystem, not just Node or JavaScript or NPM. So there's that. And then there's the other part, which is there's the whole concept of proxies giving you, first off, very fast, kind of like you don't have to go to the network, but you have like everything kind of like, in-house in the company's infrastructure. So you get like, fast install time. You get an alignment with everyone else having kind of like the same version, the same cached versions for everyone else. And so with proxies, I think in that specific NPM security chit that might be a bit more of, a little bit of the infrastructure benefits and a little bit of, configuring that correctly against dependency confusion. But these are essentially, I think, the aspects that I've got there.
No, thank you for that. We've gone full circle now from a good book of general hacker-minded thinking to your examples of very targeted, helping out NPM and the users of NPM be more secure. So I greatly appreciate that, Liran. One of the things I wanted to say before we let you go, one of the questions we ask all of our listeners is to help us complete a phrase. And that phrase is AppSec is most likely to what? So how would you fill in that blank?
I would say stay forever. That's going to be an always constant problem.
Constant problem, which I suppose is good for job security, maybe good for book sales, but hopefully you'll be able to write about new and interesting and different types of vulnerabilities in the future.
Indeed. I hope so too.
Well, thank you very much, and appreciate the Yoda hat once again. So always glad to see a bit of whimsy and fun amongst developer education. So we greatly appreciate your time, Liran. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike and Akira.
I want to thank Akira as well, and thank everybody for joining us. Stick around for interviews with AlgoSec's Chris Thomas about security in complex cloud and on-prem networks, and Vector AI's Oliver Tavakoli about applying Gen AI to XDR. And with that, remember to subscribe, share on the socials, check out the show notes, and speaking of JavaScript, check out The Return by Vectorhold. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.